I will just end my introduction to our dear friend by saying that she initiated the Cedar Mesa Perishables Project in 2011, and she's documenting a large collection of materials from southeastern Utah that were collected in the 1890s, and that's going to be the topic of her discussion tonight, and let's give a big hand.
Thanks. Good evening, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. This is my third talk to this group about this project. How many of you are new to this topic? Okay, good. Got some new people. Yeah, so I started this project in 2011, and I'm going to give you sort of an overview of the background and tell you about some of the collections that we've documented. And I think you're going to be pretty amazed at a lot of the material you see. So the 1890s, that was a time of a lot of early exploration in archaeology in the Four Corners area. This is right after the Wetherills started doing their excavations at Mesa Verde. And they and their colleagues decided to move across the border and start doing archaeological excavations in southeastern Utah. There were a number of different expeditions that were mounted during that century. This is from the Green Expedition, the Green Collection. This is two archaeologists named Charles McLeod, Charles Cary Graham, that were working in Turkey Pen Ruin in Grand Gulch. As you can see, they're not using the kinds of archaeological methods that you learn about in archaeology class today. Their big goal was putting together collections that they could sell to collectors or museums. And unlike a lot of pot hunter collectors today, they put together large collections, they kept ledgers, they kept notes, and for the most part, all of the collections they collected ended up in museums as entities rather than just little pieces. They came in as large collections. This is the area I'm going to be talking about where all this work was going on. And those of you who have been up on the developments with the Bears Ears National Monument in southeast Utah, almost everything you're going to see tonight is from the original Bears Ears boundaries before they were reduced by President Trump last year. All the way from, let's see, this is Bluff, Utah here, over to the Colorado River, which is now Lake Powell. So everything you see is going to come from the east side of Lake Powell, north of the San Juan River, over to about Bluff, and the mountains here are called the Abajo Mountains. You're going to see a little bit from northeastern Arizona, because one of the expeditions went into northeastern Arizona. So as far as we know, about 5,000 artifacts and hundreds of human remains were excavated from southeastern Utah during that 1 decade and divided among 6 museums. In the early years, some of the material was exhibited, but for the most part, for the last 60, 70 years, everything's been down in the museum basement, hidden away, never published, and no one really knew anything about these collections. The reason I got involved with this project, as Todd mentioned, was I had worked on the material from Pueblo Bonito at Chaco and Aztec, and I wanted to be able to do a regional comparison of what I was seeing with those projects. And I thought, okay, I'm going to compare it with what was taken out of southeastern Utah, these huge collections I knew about, but it wasn't until I started delving into it I realized that none of that material had been published. So I thought, somebody has to go in here and start documenting these collections, and that's when I started 8 years ago. This is just a list of the expeditions. You don't have to read through all this, but here's the museums that hold these collections. So the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago has 2 collections. American Museum of Natural History originally had all this material, and then I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but a former curator ended up taking 20% of it away, and it got sold to George High at the Museum of the American Indian in New York City. And eventually ended up at the National Museum of the American Indian, which is now part of the Smithsonian Institution. So those two institutions have these collections here. Brigham Young University has two collections that were made for the Church Museum in Temple Square back in the 1890s. And those are now at the Museum of Peoples and Cultures at Brigham Young University. And then the University of Pennsylvania Museum and the Phoebe Hearst Museum also split a collection that was made by Charles McLeod, Charles Cary Graham in Grand Gulch, and the Colorado River Canyons on the east side of Lake Powell, or Glen Canyon. Just a few more historic photos. This is Richard Wetherill's expedition, his first expedition. This is his second expedition in Grand Gulch. And this one was different than the others because of this person here. This is Richard's new bride, Marietta Wetherill, and this is how she spent her honeymoon with all these guys. And she has written an autobiography, and so if you want to know about some of this, it's really fun to read her autobiography about this. But we're really glad that she was involved because they gave her the job of keeping some of the field notes on that project. She had this beautiful penmanship. She made these little sketch maps. And so we have lots of good documentation from the notes that Marietta took on that project. Back in the 80s, a group primarily of avocational archaeologists, there was one professional, that's Winston Hurst here, but mostly they were avocational people, and they decided they were going to try to track down these collections, find out where they had gone, learn more about the history of these expeditions. And the result was this book, Cowboys and Cave Dwellers, by Fred Blackburn and Ray Williamson. So if you want to know more about these expeditions, it's a really great book. It was published by the School of American Research Press, and it's written for the public. And it's a very interesting book. So I knew about this project. I knew that they had figured out where all the collections had gone. They had made copies of all the ledgers that the collectors had put together and the museum catalogs, and they were all being stored at the Edge of the Cedars Museum in Blanding. They had created a Wetherill-Grand Gulch archive. And so I knew that they basically had laid the foundation for anyone who wanted to go study these collections. So I took the next step, and I decided I was only going to document the perishables. So, because that's what I do. So we have a lot of perishables in these collections. And that's because most of the materials have come out of these deep alcoves, deep protected alcoves that characterize the canyonlands of southeastern Utah. And as a result, we get incredible preservation of artifacts. The sandal on the left is 2,000 years old. This basket, I think, dates to about 750 AD, and it was found with all that corn in it. And then here's an 80-foot rope. That probably dates about 1000 AD. And so a lot of the material you're going to see looks like it was made yesterday. And the reason is because these alcoves, they protect artifacts from direct sunlight. It's a dry climate. You don't get a lot of fungus and mold growth in those caves. And as long as it stays dry, the materials will preserve. So of the 5,000 plus artifacts that we know were recovered during that one decade, more than 80% are perishables. And as I go along, I'm starting to think it's more like 90%. So we have, by perishable artifacts, we're talking about objects that are made of organic raw materials, such as plant materials, hides, animal materials. So we have textiles, baskets, hides, wooden implements, and feather artifacts are the main kinds of artifacts that we're studying. So in 2011, started this project. I first started it by myself, and I immediately realized that not only were these collections larger than I knew, but I also needed the expertise of other people who were specialists in different things. Because I knew textiles and I kind of knew baskets. But as you'll see, we have a team now that lends expertise to a lot of the collections. So our goals are to survey, describe, and photo the collections, and to make this information available to archaeologists, the general public, and Native communities. So we now have a 5-person team. Erin Garrity she works for Wapaki Walnut Canyon. That's her full-time job. And she got her master's in focusing on textiles at NAU. I'm the project director. Louie Garcia is a Pueblo weaver from Albuquerque. He's helping us also as a cultural specialist on the project. Chuck LaRue is a wildlife biologist. He does all the feather, fur, wood, and hide identifications for us. And Chris Lewis, who's a Zuni fiber artist, has recently joined our group. And I think we're going to have a Hopi individual join the team really soon, but I can't announce it yet. So in the first 5 years, we documented the collections at the Field Museum, Museum of Peoples and Cultures at BYU, and the National Museum of the American Indian. And then in 2016, we turned our attention to the largest collection of them all, which is at the American Museum of Natural History, about 2,000 artifacts. So I'll just show you a few pictures of us in action here. This is down in the storage room at the American Museum of Natural History. This is a 1,800-year-old twine bag. It still contains its original cornmeal. This kind of shows my fancy photo setup. All the pictures you see are just taken with a digital camera on a black cloth under fluorescent lights. Our lighting's usually pretty bad, but thank goodness there's something called Adobe Photoshop that really helps improve the photos. This is Erin and I working with a coiled basket. So here's Chuck LaRue. Chuck's from Flagstaff. So he does all the feather, fur, wood, and hide, and horn, bighorn sheep horn analysis. So there's a couple of pictures. Here he's looking at a bighorn sheep sickle, and this is one of the feather bundles. It dates back to about 1000 AD. This beautiful bundle of the big feather is macaw, and then we've got western bluebird and poor will feathers. And that was just found in an alcove. This picture of Chuck. The way we do this project is we go drawer by drawer. We just go in, we pull every drawer, make sure we see everything. And we're not looking at the pottery, we're not looking at the stone tools, and we're not really doing the bone artifacts unless they relate somehow to perishables production. So there's room if people want to get involved in this project. Here's a picture of Louie. Usually Erin and Chuck and I, we're sort of the first attack team. We go in and do most of the documentation up front, and then Louie and Chris will come in later and come in once we've looked at most of the material, and then they look at the material and give us some feedback based on their cultural experiences. So Louie's looking here at a loom anchor. I'll show you some more pictures of that. That's what holds the bottom bar of a loom, attaches it to the floor. And here he's looking at a prehistoric weaving batten. As you can see, these are in perfect condition, and he's just been floored by the quality, the craftsmanship of these tools. And this is Louie and Chris looking at some of the artifacts in the drawers and talking about their construction. One of the things they're interested in is maybe reviving some of these old techniques that have fallen out of use. It's just a picture of Chuck and Louie. It's really a collaborative project. We're really a team. We share information as much as we can, and we all benefit from that collaboration. So the main time periods that are represented by the material we're looking at from Southeast Utah are Basketmaker II. This is that earliest period of people started practicing maize agriculture in the Southwest. Not really living in large settled villages yet, but it's a very important period for the development of Pueblo culture. And as we go through the collections, I'm starting to think that at least 40% of what we're looking at dates to this very early period, which is really important. We have a little bit of Basketmaker III, and then the rest of the material dates to the later Pueblo period. And so I'm going to show you some pictures of artifacts by time period. I'll show you the Basketmaker II material, examples, and then some of the later Pueblo. Okay, so these are all from that early period. Most of our material, I think, dates to about the first or second centuries AD, say about between 100 and 200 AD. We've done some radiocarbon dating. On some of these slides, you'll see dates, and that means that we've done radiocarbon dating. So the Basketmaker culture is known, was named because of the incredible baskets that these people made. And we have, I'm sure we're up to 100 baskets. They're just beautiful. And these people were just incredibly proficient in basket making. And we have some amazing examples. This is a tray. So this is about that big, round. And these have, I think these are butterfly motifs on here. And then this is a bowl. Here's a side view of it. So you can see it's a deep bowl, and it has a circle with lightning, basically lightning kinds of designs radiating up from the center. This basket still contains its original contents of maize, pine nuts, and squash seeds, just as it was left when it was buried. And then this is another large tray. This one is unusual because it has woven-in design. It's got these small areas of woven-in design, but then somebody went ahead and painted on it too. I want to point out the center on this. We don't have great provenience information on everything, but we have seen a lot of baskets that came from funerary contexts. And during this Basketmaker II period, almost all of the baskets from those contexts have had the centers removed as part of the funerary ritual. And many of you are probably familiar with Mimbres bowls that have the so-called kill hole in them. I think that practice goes back to baskets, and that we're seeing that in the baskets from this early Basketmaker period. This is some textiles that we've recorded. These are twine bags. So these are made of yucca yarn that's been highly processed into, or yucca fiber that's been highly processed into a beautiful yucca yarn. This one has been patched with leather, or little hide patches. So this one has a radiocarbon date, and here's the date range we got. And I'm showing you medians, which is just sort of the midpoint of those dates. This is a braided band, somebody who not only knew how to braid, but used different colored yarns to create a design in a braid, which I think is pretty complicated. And these are two sandals. There's the upper and the lower face, and these are in the process of manufacture. They still have the suspension cords at the top. So the person would have suspended this from something and pulled back on the rest of the sandal to create the tension for weaving. This is all done with yucca. This is a tapestry weave, which means they're using balls of different colored yarns to weave in different areas. This is a hide, a buckskin that creates a fringe on the sandal. And so during this Basketmaker II period, the style was for people to wear footwear that had a square toe and a square heel. So this is the upper face, and this is the lower face. We don't know exactly what they were using. They were attaching that suspension cord to. It could have been a little branch on a tree or something like that. But I'm wondering if they didn't use their big toe, because I've traveled a lot in Latin America, and I've seen craftspeople down there using their toe as another digit for craft production. So I'm wondering if they didn't anchor it with their toe. This, by the way, that's our t-shirt design, if you're interested. Here's another one. This is more more often we find them like this, worn out at the heel, worn out under the ball of the foot. There's that buckskin fringe all frayed out. That's how it normally would look. This one just has a simple stripe design. We also find some really interesting caches of artifacts. This is a yucca plant, an arrowleaf yucca plant. You can see they've taken it out of the ground and the leaves are still joined at the base. They basically chopped it off at the base. And they very simply just sort of wove some of those leaves together to make a real expedient basket. So this is the bottom, this is the top. And in this basket were 3 pairs of infant sandals. And two out of 3 of them have human hair incorporated into the sandal as decorative or functional elements. So this one, the toe loop and the heel straps were human hair. This one, the chevron design, it's almost like an embroidery, was all done with human hair yarn. This has a little buckskin fringe there. You see the heel's worn out on that. This little heel was covered by part of a bird pelt. And then this one, the picture's not too good because it's, I took the picture when it was on exhibit. I think it's still on exhibit. But there's those 3 pairs in there, and you just wish that they could tell you their story, because you know there's a story there. Also in there was this netted bag containing a bundle of human hair. I've been really interested, since we started this project, in the use of human hair as cordage. This is a bundle of human hair cordage. We find a lot of these in these Basketmaker II sites. We either find bundles of just cut hair that are tied with some with a cord, or in this case, this hair was actually plied into 2-ply cordage. And as we've looked at these collections, we're finding artifacts that are woven of human hair. This is a woman's apron. On all of these that I've seen, the waist cord is human hair. So the brown waist cord coming out and that brown decorative element, that's all human hair. You can see the date on that, about 150 AD. Here we have a sandal, one of these fancy sandals, and if you look under the fringe, the first row is a row of human hair twining. So that's human hair that no one would ever see. So there's something about using this hair. I used to think, oh, it's an expedient form of fiber. All you have to do is do this and you have fiber. But now I've come to think that it's very symbolic. There's a very symbolic use of hair going on here. And one of the things I've learned in my research is about Hopi use of human hair in modern times. This is a bundle of plied human hair cords for tying up hair whorls, and this is from the American Museum of Natural History that was collected around 1910. Historically, I'm not sure how much this is still true today. Historically, young Hopi women, when they tied their hair whorls, they would tie them with a cord that was given to them by their father's sister. It was their father's sister's hair. She would take her hair, ply it into cord, and this young woman then would use that to tie her whorls. When a woman got married, the hairdo is usually like 2 sort of pigtails. That hair is tied with a cord given to her by her husband's mother, her new husband's mother. So what you're seeing are women that are using hair from the older generation. It's being passed down to the younger generation through female lines. And one of the patterns I've noticed with this hair use is that a lot of the artifacts that are incorporating human hair are women's artifacts. You see it on cradle boards, you see it on the ties used to tie the baby into the cradle board, the women's aprons. So I'm thinking it's women's hair. And we have some funerary information that was collected about 100 years ago that indicates that a lot of female women were buried with their hair cut short. So it might be something where the hair is cut from someone and then that's passed down through generations. It's a way to honor people or to remember people. I'm not saying that the Hopi model is a direct comparison, but it's showing us that in Pueblo society, contemporary Pueblo society, the use of this hair is definitely linked to kinship in some way. So it's possible that's what we're seeing 2,000 years ago in these collections. We have lots of hunting implements. This is a Basketmaker II throwing stick, in perfect condition. That's about 2 feet long. It looks like a rabbit stick. It's basically like a rabbit stick. It looks like a boomerang, but it doesn't come back to you. But they do, if they're thrown properly, they will pivot around as they're flying through the air. And they have these grooves carved into them that supposedly was to improve the velocity of the throw. This is an atlatl, of course, that it's used with a dart, pre-bow and arrow technology, and it's got Hyde finger loops. It's in very good condition. And we've got a number of dart foreshafts that are still bound with sinew to where the point is still bound with sinew to the wooden shaft, the willow shaft. When you're doing archaeology, you see a lot of points like this, but you don't see the whole tool, usually. In this case, we get to see the whole tool, the whole implement. This is a really interesting object. It's a cottonwood tray. It's kind of a concave tray. And inside are all the materials that a dart maker would have used to make an atlatl dart. So there's some blanks here. There's a little knife, stone knife. There's a brush that's in this bag. Here's a batch of sinew that would have been used to attach the point to the shaft. This is a horn flaker that was very popularly used, bighorn sheep horn, to flake stone tools. Got this big piece of hide that probably somebody put on their thigh to protect the thigh when they're doing the flaking. So here we see really a glimpse into somebody's life. Here's somebody's kit that just got put away almost 2,000 years ago. These are snare sticks. The collectors were actually pretty good at identifying things, but this is one of the things they got wrong. They called these knitting needles, but they're for catching birds and small prey. And I don't know if you can see, but there are still little human hair nooses on these. Here's close up, if you can see that. You still have their human hair nooses. And these were, usually if you wanted to catch a ground-feeding bird, you would hide those sticks under some leaves with the nooses above the ground, and the bird would step in a noose and then yank its foot, and it would close on it and catch them. So it's passive hunting. So people who were doing hunting, they could hunt birds by putting these out and then go off and do something else. And we see a lot of traps and snares that enabled people to do passive hunting. Here's some scissor snares. These would be for catching kind of small mammals. Here's a deadfall trigger. This would be used, of course, with the big rock that would fall on something small, prop up the rock. And this is a large animal noose snare. This is a square braid, cinnet. We saw some today. So it's a square braid in a noose, and it has the remains of a net on it. And these would be set out in such a way that a large animal like a deer or a bighorn sheep would put their head through there, and then as they pulled back, the noose would tighten around the neck or a leg or whatever. But if they put their head in, and if they were an animal that had horns, the horns would get stuck in the net as they were trying to pull out. So in terms of different animals that they would catch, This is one sandal. This is the top and the bottom of a sandal that's made out of the feet of a mountain lion. So there's 2 mountain lion feet here. Here's the pads on the mountain lion, and this is a sinew toe loop. So that's the bottom, and it doesn't look like it got worn very much, but that's the top. And I always think, boy, what could be more powerful than wearing a sandal made out of mountain lion feet? So we got a date on this about 100 AD. This is a fawn hide that's about 2,000 years old. It just shows you the incredible preservation of these collections. We have a lot of large animal hides, probably mostly bighorn sheep and deer. This is sinew. If Chuck LaRue was here, he would tell you that he calls this Paleolithic duct tape, because you could fix anything or attach anything with sinew. You get it wet, and you wrap it around things, and then you let it dry. And this is what people used early on to attach their projectile points to their main shafts or other kinds of implements. The sinew is made from like the leg tendons of usually a deer or bighorn sheep. This is a bighorn sheep lamb, so it's a baby bighorn sheep, whoops, without his head. The head would have been here. And it was turned into a bag, and it's all filled with corn. So the corn is all still in here. And then they like to make bags out of prairie dogs or ground squirrels. And we found quite a few of these. And I think they're the equivalent of the modern MERS, which stands for man's purse. Because a lot of them contain important things, and I could just see one of these hanging off, somebody's belt prehistorically. The head is missing on this prairie dog. What they would do is they would, I guess, remove the head or cut at the neck, and then they would just peel the whole hide off the body of the animal. But you can see his rear legs, the tail, there's the little forelegs. And this one's upside down from this one. There's the tail, and this one's filled with a type of wild tobacco. We have quite a few twined blankets, many of them in really good condition. These were sort of the warmest article of clothing that someone would have. They would have a very thick pile of the earliest ones, mostly rabbit fur, later on turkey feather. And they're made by a technique called twining, and this is just showing like the structure of these blankets. And people have done experiments on the thermal properties of these blankets, and it's very, very high. And I always think of them as the sort of the prehistoric equivalent of the Eddie Bauer down jacket. They would have done the same thing. And people would have slept on them. I mean, they were under them, they're multi-use. This is a feather blanket that I found at the Field Museum. I'm not a bird expert, but I could tell by looking at that blanket that it contained a lot of different types of bird skins in it. And this is when I met Chuck LaRue at a PECOS conference, and I met him, and we had to talk, and he looked at some of my pictures, and I realized he really knew his feathers. And I said, would you like to come to Chicago with me and come look at this blanket? He said, yeah, sure. So he came to Chicago, and he went through and put little pieces of paper on all the parts of the blanket that he thought he could ID. And then he got in touch with some of the folks in the ornithology department, and he went up and looked at modern specimens to compare them with what he was seeing in the blankets. And for example, here's a green-tailed towhee. You only get the red on the top of the head, and it's apparently the only bird, I guess, in the country that does that. And here's the bird that goes with it. So he was realizing that they were actually using the whole body skins of these birds all the way up to the beak. So he was able to identify all these birds in that one blanket. So this is like a 2,000-year-old blanket. So we got flicker, robin, red-tailed hawk, western bluebird, spotted towhee, green-tailed towhee, pinning jay, junco, dove, sparrow, lots of sparrows, and then a few turkey feathers in there. And it's not that we think that they were catching these birds to make these gorgeous blankets. What is more likely is they were catching lots of different birds for various purposes, including eating small birds, and using the body pelts to make the blankets. So in these blankets, you get the whole body skins of the birds, including the head, but no wing or tail feathers. They're saving those wing and tail feathers probably for ornament, to ornament themselves, or for ceremonial use. Several hundred bird pelts per blanket. So they're just saving up all these little pelts from these. Most of them are pretty small birds. Most of these were permanent or winter resident species. So Chuck said, yeah, they're probably catching these in the fall or winter. These birds spend a lot of time on the ground, so they're probably using those hair snares that I showed you to catch these birds. We get turkey feathers, but only in small quantities at this time, so they're probably not fully domesticating turkeys yet. And then also a few small mammal pelts ended up in there. So basically these early feather blankets are just making use of all these feathers that are being caught for a variety of purposes, but they must have been gorgeous. One use of feathers was in hair ornaments. This wooden object is a man's wooden hair ornament. It's basically a comb. You can see the sticks are kind of rounded at the bottom. They're joined with crosswise rows of sinew. And then they have this little projection at the top. And there's a base of a feather in there, a feather quill. And some of you may have seen this rock art that's very common in the San Juan, near Bluff, along the San Juan River. It's part of the San Juan anthropomorphic style of rock art. And many of these individuals have this headgear that people have called different things, antennas or some various kinds of headdresses. What I think they are these hair ornaments, because a lot of these depictions show the comb, and then they show this big mass here, and then this curled thing on the top. I think the curled thing is the feather coming off the top, and this is meant to represent a mass of feathers, a plethora of beautiful feathers. So this is one of the hair ornaments that we've recorded that has gorgeous feathers on it, and it would have had a number of other feathers hanging down off of these ties. But this one has bluebird, sapsucker, and junco. But it gives you an idea, and then it has this thing on top that would have had one coming off the top. But it gives you an idea of how colorful the world was back then. We don't really think about that, but people were ornamenting themselves, and I think it's mostly men who are wearing these. Okay, now we're going to jump ahead to later periods. I'll show you some of the later material. This is a tump band. It's absolutely perfect condition. It's made of nicely processed yucca yarn. A tump band is a burden strap, basically. It's worn across the forehead, and then where the loops are, you have attachments to a heavy load. So there might be a basket on the back, a mass of firewood, anything, but they're using their foreheads, the muscles in their neck, to support the load. And you can go down to Latin America today and see people walking along the highway that are wearing these tump bands or tump lines.
Is that weaved or painted?
It's the band itself is woven, but the design is painted on. So all that's painted on this side. If you turn that over, there's no decoration on the other side. And this is a close-up of the paint. I don't know how many of you can see this, but the paint is still three-dimensional. Somebody painted that, and then it was never used. And it was put away. It was part of a cache in a large hide with a bunch of other things. And we dated this was such perfect condition, we didn't feel like we could take a yarn off of this to date it. And so I dated the cord that held the bundle together. We got a date about 700 AD. I'll be showing you some evidence of cotton in a few minutes, but cotton comes in probably in the 900 or 1000s AD in the Southwest. So this is a band that has yucca elements going this way, the warps, and the cross elements are cotton. So this is combining yucca and cotton in a single textile. And this is part of a band that would have gone across a baby in a cradle board. We also find some really nicely worked hide clothing. We usually don't think about Pueblo people wearing hide clothing, but we found some really nice shirts. There's some sewn hats, things like that. This is another feather blanket, and this one is turkey feather. And most of the turkey feather blankets are solid color like this, but I know of 2 examples of decorated turkey blankets made with brown and white feathers. So they're creating a design which had to be pre-planned because the feathers are all wound around the vertical elements in the blanket. What they did, I think, is they put all the cord up on a frame, and then they drew the design on the warps in red. And if you look here under the white, everywhere under the white on this blanket, the yarns are colored red. And then they probably took that warp off of the frame and then wrapped the cordage with turkey feathers, and it would all be brown until you got to one of those red sections, and then you put white feathers, and then you go back to brown, put the warp back up on the frame, adjust it, and then weave it in. So this one has pretty simple design, but there's one that was from Mesa Verde area that actually was done with an interlocking scroll motif. We also get some really beautiful sandals. These are really finely woven sandals. These are the descendants of those first sandals I showed you, the one that was in the process of manufacture. The style changes over time, but the weaving quality persists in terms of these really fine sandals. These have actually a raised design on the bottom. These are diamonds. And these are from the Chaco Canyon era, and a lot of the designs on the bottom seem to correspond to designs on pottery during this period from Chaco. And then people also made more expedient kinds of sandals, more coarser weave, something that you could make in a day or a half a day or a few hours even. These are all yucca leaves. This is the thicker yucca baccata, the banana yucca, just woven in a plaited technique. And this is a finer one in the process of manufacture. So I love these. As a textile person, I just love seeing things in the process of manufacture because they really tell me how they were made and kind of the steps that people took to make things. And here, all the elements that are trending in this direction are all folded up here and tied off. And all the other ones going this way are tied off. It kind of reminds me, I'm a knitter, and when I put my knitting aside, I put it away for a while and then I come back. And this person put this aside for a while and then came back. You're just seeing a moment again in somebody's life where they put their work aside. The use of human hair does continue into the later period, not as much, but we do see certain kinds of objects that continue to be made with human hair. This is a bundle of human hair cordage, so it's actually been plied into cordage, and it's attached to these absolutely beautiful bone needles. Here's a close-up of these needles. And I assume that these were, that this was prepared for use to make these. I know the light's not too good in here because we have all the lights on. But these are leggings. They're human hair leggings. And these persist into the probably persists into the historic period until Pueblo people started using knitting and crocheting techniques to make, and wool, Spanish introduced wool, to make these items instead.
When did that happen, when they started the crocheting?
Crochet is pretty late. Knitting starts right during like the 1600s. One of the things the Spanish did in terms of tribute requirements, they would drop off fleeces in villages and say, we're going to be back in 3 weeks and we want 80 pairs of knitted stockings. So I'm sure it was the priests that were teaching people the knitting technique in the missions. Here's a late cradle board that has some human hair on it. So all that design there is all worked in human hair. And we got lots of baskets in this period. The coiling, we don't see that super fine quality of coiled basketry in the later period. People do continue to do coiled baskets, but they're just not like the early ones. Instead, plating kind of takes over. These are made with narrow leaf yucca leaves, and you might know these as sifter baskets. They still make them at Hopi, and you can use them to sift cornmeal and things like that. And they have in this case, a wooden ring that goes through. Basically, to make these, they make a flat mat, and then they fold the mat over the ring, and then fold the elements over the ring and secure them with a row of twining. This is a pot rest, using that plating technique again, just beautiful work. This is a coiled basket. This is one of the really nice coiled baskets that we've found from this period. It's elliptical shape, and it appears that is a kind of a, I've seen that shape used for ceremonial basketry in the late period, but the thought is that these might also be women's work baskets. And this one contained a bunch of balls of beautifully colored yarns, and they're yucca yarns. So cotton. Cotton comes into the Southwest probably about 2,000 years ago. When it first appeared, it comes up from Mexico into southern Arizona. And by 400, 500 AD, people in southern Arizona are growing a lot of cotton and making a lot of cotton textiles. But on the Colorado Plateau, we don't really see a lot of cotton until several hundred years later because people had to modify the plant. It's a tropical plant. It's very well adapted to southern Arizona when you're using irrigation. But to be able to grow it at Hopi that has a much shorter growing season or anywhere up north, people really had to experiment with the plant, experiment with the seeds, and modify the plant so it could grow. We don't see a lot of cotton on the Colorado Plateau till the 1000s. And then by the 11 and 1200s, people are doing a lot of weaving with cotton. So here's an example from Grand Gulch that still has some of the seeds attached. And then we have a lot of tools for the processing of cotton. So we could tell that the cotton industry was very strong. This is a cotton beater. This is used to fluff up the cotton fiber and to just kind of fluff it up to make it suitable for spinning. And sometimes people beat it, like we were down in Oaxaca. We saw people that were beating with something that looked just like this, only a little stronger. These are a little flimsier. But people are still using the same technologies in some of the indigenous villages in Central America to process their cotton. Here we have a spindle that has an intact whorl, and the whorl is made of bighorn sheep horn. We have quite a few battens. These are used with the wide upright loom for separating the yarns and holding them apart in weaving. And these are loom anchors These are, I'll show you a picture in a minute of how they would have been used. But basically, these are used so that the floor would be here, and you'd only see the loop. And the rest of this is basically rebar to hold that under a clay floor to secure it. Here's one that's, this one has corn cobs in it. This one has oak leaves. I put a quote from the Green catalog. Reverend Green was a Baptist minister, and he was interpreting some of these artifacts, and he identified these as staples to place in the floor or wall to tie the children to. And he called this a rod of discipline. Okay, so here's a picture just showing how those loom anchors would have been used. So the loops are above the floor, but everything else is basically rebar holding it below the floor. So when we find those in sites, that's telling us that people were using this kind of loom in those sites. And we have some fantastic textiles that have been found. This is the fanciest. This is a diamond twill tapestry blanket. It's probably about 4 foot square, maybe a little larger. And each of these motifs is made up of small woven diamonds. Really spectacular. And the yarns on this are so fine, they're like the threads you would find on a spool of thread. Some of these people were real masters and probably specialists in weaving. This is part of a little gambling kit, wooden cup. It's got cane dice. These are reed dice. And in this, when I took this picture, these were the 5 dice that were at the Museum of the American Indian. There were another 4 from this set there at the American Museum of Natural History. I told you that these collections got split up. Often they would just split things up regardless of whether they should all be together. We get some ceremonial material that we've seen. This is an ear of corn wrapped in cotton, natural and brown cotton, and there are bluebird feathers under here. And this was one of many items found in this jar. Then we get some really nice hafted tools. We talked before about how normally in an archaeological site you find the stone tool, but you don't see the entire implement. You get the point, you get a part of it. So here's a wooden handle that goes with this knife. And there's small holes here in the wood, and that's where, in the early days, this was nailed up on the wall in the exhibit hall. And this one I love. It's a bone awl or drill. It's still in its handle, and it has the original pitch around here. So you can see how different it is to look at this tool than to just find that bone awl by itself. Here you're seeing, okay, this is how it was held. This is what this tool looked like. This is the implement. So it's really special to be able to see that. We get lots of agricultural implements, tillers, different kinds of implements for making planting holes and things like that. I'm sure we have at least 50 that we've come across. So I'm hoping that someone will someday take on a big project and do a study of these agricultural tools. Beautiful wooden tray. They were really quite good at woodworking. This is cottonwood, so really soft wood. Beautiful little scoop. And these are crutches. These are about 4 feet high. And this is one of 2 pairs. The other pair is at University of Pennsylvania. We haven't documented it yet. This one's at the Field Museum. So these have underarm pads, hide pads that are filled with, it looks like grass or some kind of padding. We do know from osteology studies that a lot of people suffered from arthritis during this era. Could be that people used it for that, or we also see those toe and handholds going up the sides of cliffs, and maybe sometimes people took a spill. So, this is a bow drill. These seem to appear in the archaeological record pretty late in prehistory. This one is intact. It's got the bow and it's got a yucca string, I think. Yeah, yucca string. This is a spindle that has a drill attached to it for drilling items, and this was part of the fire hearth for making a fire, and it's still nailed together because it was included in an exhibit. We got arrow shafts. This one still has some of the turkey feather fletching on it. And then we get a lot of these. These are wooden foreshafts. Most people, when they think of arrows, they think of them as having stone tips, but in the late prehistoric period, at least in our assemblages, most of what we're seeing does not have a stone tip. And so when archaeologists are working at open sites and they're collecting projectile points, if they're trying to make inferences about hunting or warfare, they need to think about the fact that a lot of the arrows that would have been used during that period probably have not preserved at an open site. Okay, and this is a bow. It doesn't have the string on it, but it's a full-size bow. Okay, so that's just a few. I think I've probably shown you about 60 images, and we've documented 3,000. So you're just seeing the tip of the iceberg here. So since 2011, we've documented about 3,200 objects, generated more than 10,000 digital images at the Field Museum, Museum of the American Indian, Museum of Peoples and Cultures at BYU, and the American Museum of Natural History. So I'm almost done at the American Museum. I have about 2 more weeks of work there. And we're going to get ready to start our last big collection, which is divided among 2 museums, the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia and the Phoebe Hearst Museum at Berkeley. This was one collection that was made, and most of it is from the east side of Glen Canyon under Lake Powell, or on those tributaries of Lake Powell. That was made by McLeod and Graham. So that collection Phoebe Hearst bought it. She gave it to the University of Pennsylvania. And then when she got involved in developing an anthropology museum at Berkeley, she decided she wanted half of the collection for that museum. So it's split in 2. So the way we are sharing information on this project is through public presentations like this. But our hope is to get most of our data online through a digital perishable archive. We've been talking to the people at TDAR, that stands for the Digital Archaeological Record. That's a digital archive organization out of Arizona State University. They have been archiving a lot of the BLM and Forest Service reports, things like that. They're very interested in hosting our data, and hopefully will work with us to try to make it into a more searchable kind of database that we can put on their site. And should that happen, I hope it will, I think it will, then anyone can get a password. It'll be available to anybody. You have to register, but then you get a password and you have access. So hopefully within a couple years, we're going to start trying to do that. We have to, of course, negotiate that with the tribes and also with the institutions. So we'll see what happens. We're going to have a hard copy archive at the edge of the Cedars Museum in Blanding. That's the museum that has the Wetherill-Grand Gulch archives, and then our data will be added to that. So people can go there if you want to actually go someplace and do research. You can go there, look at all the pictures, look at all the data, and look at all the museum catalogs and field catalogs and things like that. And then eventually, our plan is to have a book that's going to be multi-authored, and we'll have people who are specialists in different things writing about those things, but also we will have some native authors in this book too, as part of our collaboration. And I think that will enhance the interpretation for everybody. So just a couple good things that have happened to us in the last couple years. Some of you may have seen this. American Archaeology did an issue that had a large article on our project. That was last year. And then a Durango filmmaker named Laurie Ruiz just finished a documentary on our project called Languages of the Landscape, the Cedar Mesa Perishables Project. We're still in the process of getting all the photo permissions on it, so I'm not at the point where I can show it. But if you'd like us to come back sometime, we'd love to show it. It's actually good. He did a good job. So I have some brochures up here if anyone's interested. And if anyone wants to make a $20 more donation, you can take a t-shirt with you. And also, we do have a affiliation with the Friends of Cedar Mesa. So they're set up to take tax-deductible contributions on our behalf. We did get a $50,000 grant from the Bureau of Land Management last year, which is huge. And so we're covered pretty well for our travel, and that's what most of our expenses have been, going to these big cities, paying for apartments, and so on. So now the money we're raising is going to go to radiocarbon dating and specialized analysis of collections. So, and here's just thanks to supporters, and that includes your organization. You guys have supported us, and some of your members have been very generous too on the project. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Yes?
Laurie, have you done any DNA on the hair? Nothing?
We have not. We haven't done any specialized analysis on anything yet. I have been told that it's really hard to do DNA on hair if you don't have the follicle, which is where it comes out of your head. But then I heard something more recently that maybe it is possible. Most of this hair, I think, has been cut off. And also, I don't think we would even try to do that without getting permission from the tribes. So we'd have to talk to some tribal groups, see if they're even interested in trying to trace some of these matriline connections. So no, we haven't done it, but it's definitely an intriguing idea. Yes?
So you set out to do some comparison between Chaco, Mesa Verde, perishable things, and what you found at Cedar Mesa. How did those two sets of perishable artifacts compare?
We definitely have a kind of a Chacoan component in southeast Utah that is in the 1100s. This is a time when they're building a lot of those Chaco outliers in the northern Southwest. And that one decorated sandal I showed you, that's very Chaco-esque. But there are other kinds of things that we found at Chaco and Aztec that we find at these sites during the 1100s. After that, I think those regions kind of go their separate ways. This area of southeast Utah, it's known as the Western Mesa Verde area. So it has more affinities to sort of Mesa Verde than to Chaco. But during the 1100s, people probably came up from Chaco and started building Chaco structures. And so we see some connections there. And I should also mention that, especially over in a number of the areas that we're looking in, there's a Kanta component where people crossed the San Juan River and built structures, created settlements in that area. And so we can trace some of the Kanta stuff coming over too. Yeah.
There is a Chaco great house at Bluff.
Right. There's a great house at Bluff, and there's one in Comb Wash. Yeah, Linda.
So you mentioned embroidery. We saw lots of weaving. What about knotting? Do we see sewing?
You know, we don't get really much embroidery. I talked about on those baby sandals. Yeah, those yarns I think were added maybe later. But for the most part, we don't see embroidery in the Southwest, except for a mending technique.
And like the sewed?
I think that's a, what do you call it, like an overhand stitch with cotton thread on that shirt.
Oh, it was.
Yeah, it's with cotton thread. The earlier ones, you get sinew, used as a sewing material, yeah. But in the later ones, at least these were cotton yarn. So that would help us date it also, yeah. In terms of knotting, in terms of like netting, like nets, we have a few, but we don't have a huge number of them. Yes?
Could you explain what the scissor sticks were?
The snares?
Oh, for snares?
Yeah, they're a type of snare, and they're like a V, and I don't actually know exactly how they were used, but somehow they were set in such a way that it would catch the animal in there and pinch it.
I haven't heard of it.
Yeah, they're called scissor snares. Yeah. Someone had a question? Yeah.
I noticed a lot of color in some of the textiles. Is that natural color or dye? And if it's dye, are you doing an analysis on the dye?
The color, the most common color palette that you're seeing is red, black, and a natural yucca or cotton color.
Is it
Cochineal? I don't think so. No one has done much in the way of dye or pigment analysis on textiles. I'd love to find the right student who wants to take it on, who has a strong chemistry background. I mean, that's what it's going to take. So there really hasn't been that much work done, but the potential is very great because we have all these collections that could be done. I, at this point, think that a lot of the red and black we see might be pigment from minerals, but that's not definite because no one's done the analysis. Yeah, but cochineal, there's really no evidence that anybody used cochineal in the Southwest, even though we get the bugs down here on the prickly pear, that anyone was using it as a dye except wealthy people in Santa Fe area, where it was coming up from central Mexico on the trail. But there's really no evidence of prehistoric use of it. But like I said, there have not been really good studies on that. Yeah. Yeah. Yes?
For both the spinning and the weaving, were they done by both men and women and children?
Well, that's a good question. Historically, the weaving is done by men in the Southwest, or at least in the northern Southwest. And usually the various family members would help with things. The photos we have of spinners are men spinners. So I'd say primarily most of the textile production is being done by males. A lot of our evidence focuses on the fact that a lot of the settings for looms are occurring in kivas. And based on historic records, men use those spaces for weaving historically. I think it probably was men who are using the loom, but I don't think men, I think it's women making all the finger woven things. So like that beautiful band that we saw, probably the sandals. Most likely that's women's work, and the loom and the cotton is probably male. But we have no way really to know. So, yeah.
I'm just curious, like, what do they have to do in the museums to preserve all these different things? What kind of conditions?
They really aren't doing a lot of active preservation, but most of these museums have upgraded their storage cabinets. And so they now have them in metal storage. The drawers are padded with ether foam, and they just close those doors, and those tend to mitigate fluctuations in humidity when you have good sealed cabinets. So most of these museums have upgraded the cabinetry. When I first started in the 80s looking at these things, they were all in old wooden drawers, and so most of these museums have upgraded that, but they really haven't had to do anything except make sure that you're not getting insect damage and trying to just store them well. Yeah. Yes?
When you go to these museums, do you have a certain amount of time they give you, hours, how many people they allow in? Do you have to wear gloves? How do the logistics work?
I've been working in museums since, for 30 years. So I have good connections in these museums, but they have been incredibly generous when I have gotten in touch and said, oh, we want to come, I want to bring a 3-person team for a month. And part of it is that we are helping them too, because they haven't really done much with these collections, and we're going to share all our data with them. But we work a regular work day. It depends what their hours are for visitors. So usually it's 9 or 10 to 4 or 5, at least 6 hours a day. And they let us, for the most part, we've been able to work in storerooms, or they'll bring the collections to us. But it's mostly because, you know, I have the experience of working in those museums. So we've just been lucky, but they've been very generous with their allowing us to do that. It's a big deal because they really have to designate some of their personnel to help us. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you for coming. I'm happy to talk to you.